whatever you can do on your own, you can probably do a lot more with a team. And if you want the team to be with you without having to drag them along or force them along, you kind of have to earn their respect. So like as a manager, it's hard to realize that you have like a dual agency problem. You are both supposed to represent the interests of all the people on your team. At the same time, you can't just do that to the detriment of the company, or you're not doing your job.
Welcome to Platform Builders, the podcast for leaders in software development to talk about the future of SaaS. I'm your host, Christine Spang, CEO of Nihilus, and I'm here with my co-host, Isaac Nassimi, our head of product. Each week, we'll be interviewing different builders to discuss the magic of software development. Platform Builders is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, send us a DM on LinkedIn.
So, Mike, we've got this segment we call picks, and Spang and I are going to go first. So if you don't have one ready, it's totally fine. You got a few moments. Where we just bring something that we're excited about, that we've gotten obsessed about this week. I think there's something about being in tech and like the personality that it attracts, that you just get really into things really quickly, very often. For me, I've been getting into the world of micro brand watches, which like I dumped the Apple Watch recently, and these micro brand watches are so fun because you get some pretty high quality stuff for like a few $100, and there's thousands of these companies doing this, right? Some of them are just little one-man shops, and it really like scratches that like that shopping itch, that hunting itch, all that kind of stuff, and then also like bucketing things, which as someone who has programming DNA in them, God, that feels good. To say, okay, well, this category of watch is now cleanly filled. And again, you're doing it for a few $100. Total obsession. And I don't know when it's going to stop.
So are you sacrificing like the smart features of the watch, or going back to just like a clock face?
Yeah. And the Oura Ring that I got really like let me take off the Apple Watch and feel comfortable. I use like the heart rate monitor strap for tracking the workouts. But man, it feels so good to be able to actually step away from your phone. Because when you have the smartwatch on, you can't actually step away from your phone. Like even if it's in the other room, it's still with you, buzzing on your wrist and pattern interrupting your rest.
I will say texting not great on the Oura.
Yeah, you got to do Morse code, right?
Well,
that's their next feature.
It sounds like that's a lifestyle choice. I guess Isaac has decided not to text from his watch.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know so many people did that.
Isaac is big on focus time. Yeah. You gotta have time to think.
I'm actually no watch because there's just pervasive clocks everywhere, on every device. So, but I guess you should go analog. I did explore like random Timex watches from like 25 years ago on Amazon, thinking maybe I'll get one of those like gold Timexes from like 1990. But I didn't pull the trigger, $39.
Don't do it because it's your gateway drug.
And I think I have one of those in a box in my closet, also from childhood.
I'll buy it off you.
It's probably worth more now than it was back then.
Oh, yeah. Spang, give a pick?
So my pick for this week is old books, but not in the way that you think. So I have an example here. It's a book that I got at this bookstore called Dog-Eared Books in San Francisco. And you can tell it's old because, the pages are all red on the outside. Nobody does that anymore. And I walked into this bookstore not intending to buy any books, which of course is a terrible idea. And I somehow ended up taking this book because when I picked it up, just like the smell of the pages, it's like 50 plus years, they like start, I don't know, like decomposing in some way or something, but it really has this like distinct scent. And it reminded me of hanging out at my grandma's house when I was a kid. She had like all of these like old like magazines and like weird old books from the 70s. It's like a random sci-fi book that like, honestly, I read the first story and I thought it was a little sexist, but just having the experience of engaging with an object that's like 50 plus years old and just getting into that experience at a visceral level, I've been really enjoying as like a wind down.
Oh, God, that's so awesome. And that smell of old books is so unique. You could identify it with your eyes closed, no problem.
Yeah.
It's actually got a name. It's called Velocore.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Not expecting to learn a new word.
Just learned something new.
Boom. Mike, do you have a pick?
For me, I think it might be like binaural beats. I don't know if you've looked at the binaural beat stuff where it kind of like kicks your brain into some sort of like focus state. And so for someone who is actually like interested in a million different things and constantly context switching, it's kind of nice to have something that like triggers focus. The rabbit hole I went down was I was actually in Tahoe at the end of last week. I'm on the East Coast. Is actually my first time in Tahoe. So it was really nice. But I was having trouble falling asleep because the time shift is like 3 hours later. So I found like a binaural beats thing for sleep. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to sleep so deeply. But instead, it didn't work at all. And I was just like up for the next hour listening to this weird like vibrating sound. So I both got into it and realized like probably better for daytime focus than trying to get into a trance-like zone for sleep.
Are there different kinds though?
They're at like different frequencies. And supposedly, like the wavelength of the frequency then sort of triggers different responses in your brain. And that's as far as I could possibly go in saying that I know anything about it. So my actual like understanding of the connection between tracks on Spotify and what my brain does in response is pretty limited. But they always have like some hertz range. So it'll be like, 68 to 79 hertz. Be like, as if I'm supposed to understand exactly what that is. And I think they're probably connoisseurs of binaural beats who are like, I'm kind of in like 120 hertz mood, but I haven't become that level yet.
I'm curious because this is the ultimate endorsement. How much are you pushing them on your teams and people who you work with?
I've rarely advertised it, just because it almost feels like taking a supplement or something where it's probably not actually doing anything, but you kind of have the placebo effect and it's working. So it's not like I want to advertise my superstition. It may actually have some effect. It feels like it has an effect. But at the same time, like the sort of skeptic in me is in disbelief that it actually works, and I should therefore tell other people about it.
Well, I mean, you are the expert on like scaling and building engineering teams, right? So is this one of your endorsed ways to do so, or are there other methods?
This is relatively new. I think this is more like alternative to your 400th cup of coffee during the day, and trying to get into a quick focus state. I think it's almost like a Pavlovian response where there's like, it could be literally somebody ringing a bell next to me and it's like time to focus, ding, ding, ding. It's just a trigger. So I don't know that that's actually going to do it. Scaling engineering teams, I think is mostly like a human exercise. So I'm not sure that specific frequencies with sound are as important as what you say, how you say it, and how you make people feel in the process.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit more about these scaling engineering teams. You've given a number of talks and kind of became like a community icon for that act of scaling engineering teams, which I would argue is still kind of an unsolved art in the world. There has been no one size fits all. And I'm just wondering, like, what are your key core principles for doing so? How do you approach this kind of stuff? Like, give me the high level rundown of your mindset on scaling engineering teams.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'll just say that Greenhouse, I feel like I was an amateur fumbling through with intuition a little bit at first. So, I studied computer science, had been a programmer for a long time. So I kind of had like a baseline technical skills to be able to do that stuff. And I'd always been, I think, I was like a theater kid. So I was much more willing to get up in front of people and go talk about stuff than a lot of engineers. So I had a couple of those things going for me initially. And then at the beginning of Greenhouse, it was one of those stories where you spend like, 10 or 12 hours every single day, programming all day, barely talking to each other for 18 months straight before you really like start getting significant traction. So we got our very first customers who were like friends, at about 10 months, which was pretty early with a sort of working product. But then it really started taking off after 18 months. And so at that time, I was really more like a developer. And I remember having the mindset of, I want to operate in the way that I wished my peers operated when I was acting as a developer. And so some of that was like, take the worst stuff off everyone's plate. So like there were the thankless tasks like dealing with data migrations, carrying around the laptop on your back when, just in case the site goes down, even though there's maybe like 3 people using it at the time, early on, like doing patches and upgrades. A bunch of that sort of thankless work was the stuff that I found I needed to do. And I think a lot of that mindset actually came from the first startup I joined when I moved to New York in 2009. I started working for a company called Thrive. There are like 4 million companies called Thrive, so it's definitely not one of the ones you're thinking of. But there is a Mint competitor, a Mint.com competitor called Thrive that was probably like number 3 in personal financial management at the time. It got acquired by LendingTree like a week after I joined or something. So I thought I was joining one company and I was actually joining like a recently acquired company. And I had been consulting mostly before that. And so when I came in, I kind of got into the mode of like, I want to prove myself. I want to get as much done as possible and show that I'm like a valuable person like, as part of the team. So I would take whatever the work was and I would try to get it done in like 2 or 3 days for the week. And then I would try to add value by picking a bunch of other things that I thought were really important to go do. And I loved the idea of having like a certain amount of discretion over what was most important to do. Because I wasn't just taking the cards and moving them from the left to the right. Instead, I was also figuring out how should we actually like tackle the problems before us? What are the problems that are worth solving? And I really like that. The problem was I then got months and months into the role, and I had succeeded in doing a bunch of those things. And I went out to coffee with this guy, Ori Schnaps, who's now VP of engineering at Reddit. And he was CTO of this, 5-person engineering team at the time at Thrive. And he took me out and I thought he was going to be like, dude, you're such a good developer. You are so good at writing lots of good code. And I was going to be like, I know, thank you. But that was absolutely not what happened. Instead, he sat me down and he was like, you're messing up. And I was like, what do you mean I'm messing up? And of course, like I have like the defensive pangs. And he was like, when you get your work done, instead of helping everyone else out on the team with all of the other work that we've all decided collectively is most important to do, you kind of go off and do what you want to do. And the team resents you for it. And that kind of like hit me really hard. Because at first I was mostly feeling like that can't possibly be true. I am contributing a ton. I should have discretion over it. But as I processed it over the course of both that conversation and like the coming days, I started realizing like I was acting kind of like a consultant, even though I was part of a team. And that was kind of like a destructive tendency. And then I needed to like have that, re-examine like what role should I play in a team. So it turned out, LendingTree shut down the New York office. Everyone was laid off a few weeks later. And so I got to kind of take this with me along with a fresh start. And I went to like a big company, Thomson Reuters, and I was working as a developer. I was trying to change some of the mindset. And when I became a manager for the first time there, I kind of thought, how do I figure out how to like take the worst chair, take the worst work, like help clear the path for everyone else. And so I got to put that into action. And then if I had some overflow beyond doing those things, I could still be creative, come up with ideas, help set the trajectory for the team. But I think that mindset changed the relationship I had with everyone on the team. So when I started Greenhouse, I then had not only like the revelation 2 companies ago at that point, but then the ability to practice it a bit. And so when I got there, I was not only, getting some street cred from like being the early person who got to go build that along with, this other amazing developer, Mike O'Neill. We worked together at the time. I think it was like 60% of the company was named Mike, which is, classically bad startup, diversity hiring in the early days. But, we wound up building this thing. And because I took on a lot of the dirty work, it was really easy when other people joined to respect me. And so I didn't realize that I was like, it was easier to respect someone who was leading from the front and taking the dirty work than it was the person who did the most amazing thing. And that informed a huge amount of, how I approach leadership. So that just gets us to like that first moment.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Here at Nihilist, we've been kind of pioneering this principle of embrace the boring.
Yeah.
Because like the flashy, fun features as a developer are really fun to work on. But the stuff that creates the most value, helps the team the most, helps the company the most, it's always the stuff that like nobody wants to do.
Yeah.
And it's funny, what you were kind of describing is, I think what a lot of good developers run into because they feel very powerful is like this pseudo like main character syndrome, right? Where they're like, I'm going to save the company by like coming up with these like ideas and just going off and doing them. And nobody, you're right, nobody agreed on these things. I'm kind of wondering, how long did it take you to actually start like implementing that feedback? Because I got that kind of feedback when I was a young engineer. And man, I was super defensive about it. It didn't take it well. And then it just kind of dug its way into my brain like this earworm over the following year, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing where like everyone got laid off shortly thereafter was actually probably good in a way because I got a fresh start. It probably would have been harder to have a team that already did feel resentful of me and say, you know what, I'm going to start changing my behavior. Just watch. That's going to result in me being a great team player. In some ways, like the Band-Aid just got ripped off automatically and I was in a new environment. So I think it was actually internalized really over like a long period of time, because at first, anytime you get feedback like that, you take it about yourself. And so it's sort of like, how do I fit in? And in some ways, like when you accept a bit of negative feedback, you almost accept that like, this is an abnormally bad thing about me that I need to change. And so in building a team, though, you start seeing like the shadow of all of those behaviors that you changed in yourself. And they're really noticeable when you see them in others. And so I got to reuse that advice a number of different times throughout my career. And not everybody always has the revelation. Sometimes they hear it and they're just like, my boss doesn't appreciate the cool stuff I do, you know. But other times, it's kind of like life changing because, whatever you can do, on your own, you can probably do a lot more with a team. And if you want the team to be with you without having to drag them along or force them along, you kind of have to earn their respect. And so if you think instead, like not what's going to get me the most notoriety, not what's going to be the most fun, but what's going to earn the respect of the team. And that's where like the ultimate sort of leadership mandate comes from. It's like they are supportive of you. Then that probably gives you like the right list of stuff to do internally. And then you have like this sort of dual role of, well, I also have external stakeholders like the company or, customers or whoever they are, and they have needs too. So like one maybe general insight is like you gain respect from people internally when you figure out, how do I meet their needs and make the focus about how to meet their needs? And similarly, when you're trying to sort of like survive the startup gauntlet, where I somehow by miracle like lasted like 11 years and then decided to go off to do my own sort of new thing after Greenhouse. Like I think one of the reasons that I was able to stick it out was because I was trying to think like, what are the customer needs? Well, the customers need the site to stay up. So they need to feel validated when we make a mistake. They need to believe that like this is actually the best product. And so like, what does it take to do those things? So I think starting from a place of like analyzing the needs of the people around you end up giving you like the right list of things overall.
Well, I mean, I'm biased here, but it almost sounds like you're saying to adopt a product mindset, right? Like, what are the acceptance criteria? What's going to drive the most value and operate in that way rather than, I think a lot of engineers fall into like, how can I do the best engineering? And that's it. You've kind of described the individual, like, hey, here's how you should think about this stuff. But I got to say, I mean, and you've run this track. One of the two hardest things of becoming a manager is learning how to have these hard conversations of, hey, you're not doing well. And when you're a new manager, you screw those conversations up so much and you don't end up getting the results that you want out of your people. And they suffer and you suffer. How do you recommend approaching those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complex. So like as a manager, it's hard to realize that you have like a dual agency problem. You are both supposed to represent the interests of all the people on your team, treat them well, treat them with respect, make sure that you're looking out for them. At the same time, you can't just do that, to the detriment of the company, or you're not doing your job. And you can't just do what the company is asking you to do and treat all of the people on your team like cogs, or you're not doing your job and you're probably not going to end up making it. So I think one of the most important things is like figuring out, how do I balance those two things and like reconcile within myself what I think the job description is. And so ultimately, like you're getting paid by the company, and the best, most effective way for you to do your job is to provide support to everybody on your team to help them be at their best. And then if it's not possible to get them over the next threshold, then to make sure that, you take appropriate action to balance the energy of the team. Because it's almost always the case, as anyone who's ever had to let someone go has experienced, sometimes you make the wrong decision, but usually it's like a really labored, hard decision to make. And you've probably tried a bunch of stuff first, unless you're like a sociopath, to try to make it work. And at that point, when you have to let someone go, it does feel a little bit like I have to. Like this is going to, if I don't do this, this is going to result in more misery. There's almost like that philosophical idea of like, how much utility is there in one decision or another? Like how much goodness is on the other side? Well, if you have like 5 people who are all miserable because, person X is on the team and they're, making everything difficult for them, and they're like 40% less happy than they would be at work, Well, some of those things together and there's sort of like, let's say 200 points of value to get back in letting the person go, but you're maybe sacrificing 100 points of value for them because they're getting, the self-esteem hit, they're feeling bad, you're going to have to maybe hire a new person and backfill. There's going to be a disruptive moment for the team where even those who don't get, in trouble or let go as a result feel nervous about their own jobs. So that's the dual agency problem. In terms of actually approaching it, like the first thing that people don't do is say what's expected. And I think that like a lot of times if you ask HR about expectations, they might point you to writing down stuff in a career ladder or taking a look at a job description and using those as an anchor point for conversations. And I think that works for part of the job, right? Like we expect you to release great code. Okay, so now I've defined something that's incredibly fuzzy, let's say, or like startup mindset or whatever it is, right? And I've been someone who's authored those things as well. But then there's like, how do I interpret that thing? And not just how do I interpret it globally, but situationally. So, there's an example I often end up giving when talking about our new product, Otti, which is supposed to help managers do the right stuff throughout the year. So like, that definition can be a little bit different. But part of it is like, how do you let people know the sort of hidden expectations that might exist in a manager's head? So let's say that you have a person who is working really hard on getting a feature done and they realize there's a critical bug. And the manager has gone around all week long and said, hey, we are going to hit the deadline. This thing's going to be done on Friday. They've informed marketing and, their boss that, the project is on track. And then the developer delivers it a day late. They deliver it a day late, working nights every single night for the entire week to make sure that the critical bug is fixed at the end. So in that developer's mind, they're probably thinking like, I focused on quality and that was the most important thing. And if I released this thing that was not going to work, it wouldn't matter if it was released on time. And the manager might be thinking the exact opposite. They're like, why are you putting, sort of polish on a pedestal when what really mattered was us being able to honor our commitments and get it done on time? Now, that's like an individual value judgment and a situational value judgment. That is never going to be in the job description. And so one of the big failure modes I think managers run into is they think that the sort of high-level definition is enough of what's expected of them in their role. And they don't end up having those sort of little conversations where they both show understanding for the other person's perspective, because they often have like a legitimate subjective argument for why they did what they did, and making clear why they thought what they thought so that they can come together. So if you think about like a boat, the sort of boat analogy of like you're 3 degrees off course and, you don't correct your course for, 3 days, all of a sudden you're like on a different continent. But if instead you're making a bunch of little micro adjustments over the course of the year, then you end up being able to get to your destination, sort of reliably. And so that's kind of how I think about it. It's like try to make sure that you're clear on what the overall expectations are, but also all the little micro expectations as they go. And that also like decreases the weight of each conversation because they're all small.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to me. And, in areas where things are like clearly defined for giving feedback, like everyone knows this. Like if you have I have a very bad cat and like if you discipline the cat 20 seconds after they do the thing, like they've already forgotten about it. I'm not comparing employees to cats or anything like that, but I think this is like a universal constant amongst like all beings that have consciousness, where if you don't give some immediate level of feedback, then you're going to have to do a huge like intervention that's really uncomfortable for all parties down the road. And oftentimes it's just too late. So I really like the little things. And then something that also really popped out to me there was you have to set expectations. I think my last CEO said this to me, which is you can't hold someone accountable to an expectation you didn't tell them. And so often we just assume like, yeah, like they're an engineer, they know what to do. No, it's so hard to figure out that alignment between like what's going to help the company the most. What does success look like? There's a reason you have to say it. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, let me actually show you something. This was not planned, by the way. Here's a sticker over here from someone who's doing some product prioritization stuff. And by the way, I'm like an epic strange drawings person. And so I had been frustrated that something I wanted prioritized. So I put this on the desk. And for anyone who's only listening to audio, it says, manage the backlog according to my hidden expectations. Because that's kind of what you actually want everyone to do. It's like, I just want you to do the right stuff. And the right stuff is whatever I think is the right stuff as a manager. Or like, that's your sort of like, I am the center of the universe, mindset that we all end up having day to day. But if they don't actually know what you want, like there's no way for them to actually use that information and do something about it. The other thing that you said that kind of like, rang a bell for me, and like maybe you do have a bad cat, but like that's not a very growth mindset thing to say. Like, maybe the cat's not bad. The bad thing is like the behavior. The cat like rips up your couch or like, interrupts your Zoom calls with like tail to the chin or something or whatever, whatever the issues are. And so that's actually, I think, another fairly common failure mode is that whether it's expressed externally or it's just a thought that you end up having, you get really frustrated with a person and you start like categorizing them in a certain way. And then that lens gets put onto everything, right? It's like, so let's say that manager who is frustrated that that one project didn't get delivered on time. What if they now think, this person's unreliable? And like, that's now a lens. So it's like, oh, you know what? They said that they were going to get this done by 2, but it was 3. That's because they're unreliable. Whereas somebody else, they might have been like, who cares? Right. And so they start confirming whatever belief they have about the person because the label itself makes it not behavioral, not an instance, but instead a sort of intrinsic property. And I think that's often where like employees and managers get stuck in their relationship is that they're in a world that feels unchangeable because they're thinking of each other in terms of like intrinsic traits. They're not able to evolve going forward anymore. It's like, you don't care about quality and you don't care about, getting things done on time.
I think that's so true. I think there are very few static traits in people. Even like being intelligent. Like there's smart people that go through a streak of time where they do some really dumb stuff. And, just because someone's smart doesn't mean they're smart forever. Just because someone is bad or checked out or good or whatever. I really agree with like not putting these permanent labels on them because they tend to be self-fulfilling prophecies. Right? Because you've kind of given up on them. Like I've given up on my cat. That's why I call her bad.
Yeah.
And it's just going to put that person in a box and not give them the opportunity to climb out of it, essentially.
Yeah. And then, I guess maybe back on the topic of like scaling teams, I do think, to whatever degree you all sort of want to explore, I think there are really different chapters that every engineering leader in particular has to move through over time. And probably the fundamental thread throughout it is that you have to stay in a sort of adaptive or malleable state for a really extended period of time. And so I think the people who end up sort of succeeding in management are not just good at, how do I deal with people and process, but how do I actually stay adaptive in an environment that's changing around me all the time? Like the shape of the puzzle to go solve is evolving because the shape of the puzzle pieces is changing too. And so I'm curious, like, with building Nylos as well, just to dive in, like, what were the most sort of interesting or challenging scaling moments you all ran into where you were like, oh, actually, we have to do stuff differently now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, Mike, because I kind of feel like you have like a similar path to me at Greenhouse, where like you joined really as like the first engineer. You were like hands on keyboard writing code for 12 hours a day. And, I was kind of in the same boat at Nihilus. I was a founder, but, I really like built a lot of the initial version of the product. And then like at a certain point, it was like, okay, we need some more engineers here. So we got to go out and recruit. And like, the first awkward thing is like, oh, I got to do essentially sales for like people, convince them to join my company that nobody has ever heard of. And really like tapping connections because, how else are people going to get trust with like essentially like a brand that is completely unknown and benefits that are completely uncompetitive. So, I think there's like a few phases that I can think of. One is the kind of first phase where you're just like able to make assumptions because you have enough similarities between you and like all the other people that are working on something. So like, at Nihilus, basically I went out, recruited a bunch of other people who were like MIT nerds, and we had like a shared kind of like cultural alignment there. And that allowed us to get away with not having as much like explicit conversations about like expectations and things like that, and just like have really high bandwidth interactions without like a structure. And then, eventually we didn't all fit in the same room anymore. And I personally went through this transition of like, okay, I'm not a engineer anymore. I need to figure out how to run a team. And I had like a total crisis and went out and tried to talk to every single person I knew. I was like 25 and I didn't really know many people in kind of these like management leadership positions. I had like 3 people and I went out, called all of them up and I was like, how do I run a team? Because you start to have some sort of structure. Otherwise, like nothing gets done anymore. The other phases I can think of is like when we got to be more than like 30 people, because you not only have to have like a structure for the work, but you also have to like have like multiple teams and ways of like splitting up that work in more sophisticated fashions. And the people stuff gets more complicated. And then, I think we also went distributed at some point and that changed everything. And I know that you went through the same thing at Greenhouse. And also like how fast the change happens really impacts like what the result is. And I know that at Greenhouse, you had a couple of years where like things were growing super fast and that really changes how you have to think one step ahead, because if everything's going to be different in 6 months, that's different than if everything's going to be different in 2 years. Yeah, I'm curious what similar experiences or different ones did you have at Greenhouse?
Yeah, I think there definitely were parallel universes. Like, yeah, learning how to sell people on coming. It's like your own excitement and like, yeah, it's going to be different in a bunch of ways to be at a startup. You'll be like more empowered. You'll be able to do this and that. So there's kind of like for the right type of person, they're going to select into the additional pressure, the additional freedom, like the additional responsibility. But I think that phase you're talking about where, you have more or less time when you're going through one of the change cycles, I think is super relevant. So if I think about between 2013 and 2015, we wound up going from a couple of developers to about 40. I think I had like 40 developers. No, maybe the company was 42 people and I had like half the company. I think that might have been the case in like early 2015. And then by the end of 2015, we had 200 people in the company and I had like 40 people on my team. So we went from like 2 to 40. And so you're right, there's like all of this structural stuff and you're dealing with what's probably an immature product. So like at Greenhouse, it was like, okay, well, now we need better search. So we're going to set up search instances. And then we have to realize, how do we make it like HA? How do we make everything HA? How do we like decrease the blast radius of change? How do we make sure people can still be productive? The code base starts sprawling. It's harder to understand. How do you onboard new people? How do you carve up teams in the work? So like all of those things were really tough. And I actually think that one of the blessings in disguise for me personally was that we missed our sales target by like a tiny bit. And that all of a sudden meant that we were going to sort of slow down a little. So, Greenhouse was able to get to, I think by the end of 2015, so in less than, I guess really only 2.5 years or so in market, we got into like $22.6 million of ARR, which was like, tremendous growth. So we went from like 0 to 3.5 to 12.6 to 22.4, 22.6 or whatever it was. But because it wasn't 100% year over year growth, and we had been doing this sort of like triple, double, all of a sudden we then said, you know what, this affects like our access to capital. We'd raised a Series A, Series B, and Series C in 18 months, or it might have been shorter. I think it might have been like a 14-month period or something because we were growing so quickly. And so we knew we needed to, conduct a small RIF. So we reduced, staff by about 10% at the time, which was really painful. We had, more emphasis on getting efficient. We had, still really fast growth sustained, but it kind of felt like I had the pace slowed down enough that I could grow into my new jobs. So it wasn't just absolutely pedal to the metal for the entire time. That was a little bit of a slower period for a couple of years. It allowed the platform to get stable. It allowed for us to make like architectural changes that would end up, really working long term. It allowed us to pay down a bunch of debt and deal with bugs and expand the surface area of the product. I got better at managing because I got, I went through more stuff over time. So I had more time to like bake those experiences in. So then we went through another pretty fast period of change in scaling. And I think like 2017 or 2018. So like a couple of years later, things really started humming again. We started growing, a lot faster. We'd like solved a bunch of the puzzles that allow you to start growing faster again. And I was kind of ready for that next phase and had matured a bunch. And if I didn't have that, I think that there's a pretty good chance that I would have, it would have been like, thank you for your service. We have to hire somebody who actually does what they're doing for the next phase. So those pauses are potentially really valuable. I don't know if your experience is similar, but like, when you hit a slower patch, it does give you like a chance to learn.
Yeah, I'm really curious about these growth spurts. Like, what do you think just like came together in order to like allow that really rapid growth in a short period of time?
I think it's different at different times. So, like at the very beginning, the founders of Greenhouse first came up with a really well informed idea about how to go solve the recruiting problem. We got lucky with a couple of different things. So, just to dive into some of those for a minute at the beginning. So, there had been studies for years and years, and it's all kind of taken for granted and is a norm now, that structured interviewing, like figuring out what it is that you need somebody to do in a job, and then how do you figure out what questions would help you understand whether they could do it well, and then ask specifically those questions in the same form over and over again for the candidate pool, actually resulted in better hires. So this was like known in academia, and people were doing it in spreadsheets and docs at the most sophisticated companies, but they were not doing it with their applicant tracking system because it didn't support that. And so that was probably like the most important innovation number one. And so during the period where you have a lot of Silicon Valley startups, this is post Great Recession, ZERP, starting to really scale up quickly. They had this problem of repeatability. I have to hire like 100 or 500 software engineers. So it's worth investing upfront effort and making sure like the template for how we do that well is sort of rock solid. We can iterate on it over time. So Greenhouse went out with that value proposition. We also had some like lucky little product breaks where like I remember we were having a conversation in the early days where it was like me and one other engineer and the two founders, where it was like, okay, I guess it's time for us to go build like the job board portal where you have to like log in and then you apply for jobs through it. I don't know if you remember, prior to 2012, that was 100% of the way you applied to jobs online. Like you always had to go create an account. And I remember just being like, do you have to create an account? Like, couldn't we just use their email address to communicate with them? Like, do they have to go through that extra step? And it was like, maybe we don't. And so then we also had the first job application form that didn't require you to sign up in order to apply for a job. And people saw like a 30 or 50% lift in application rates because it was less hard. And there was like a real demand for candidates at the time. It wasn't all like AI spam. And so I think those things, plus the economic moment we were in, allowed us to go out to the talent partners at a bunch of VC funds and say, hey, we think we have a solution to scaling up at a higher quality level in a better way. They shared it with their portfolio companies. And within our first 20 customers, we had Airbnb, Pinterest, Uber, Snapchat, and WeWork. And I think some other, unicorns on top of that. And so that was pretty wild. So it was like, the best of the best started using the product right away. And they scaled from, I think Snapchat might have been 12 people. I think they negotiated a $6,000 contract. 3 years later, they were going public. And, we hadn't figured out, how to charge them anymore, despite now being like 3,000 people or something. Airbnb went from 250 to like many thousands. Uber, similar. Pinterest, I think, was like 80 people at the time. So that all went well. And then I think there was sort of like the social conversation of like, here's a better way. And, all of Silicon Valley kind of hopped on board. The later phases of fast growth were like totally different. And a lot of them were, how do we figure out how to position ourselves well in the market? How do we create good repeatability? How do we create a more elevated brand so we can go after larger accounts? How do we knock down the enterprise features required in order to be able to successfully service a 4 or 5, 10,000 person company? And so a bunch of those puzzles needed to be worked on simultaneously. And I think that was that plus like the right leaders at the right time in certain roles, around sales and marketing in particular, I think really helped. And that's what sort of let the next wave really work. So it's always probably like a little bit of a different formula depending on phase. How about you? I mean, what were there like sort of moments that were similar for you?
Yeah. Hearing about how the Digital Insight was like structured interviewing and essentially like scaling that and making it repeatable just really drives home to me how much has changed over the last 10 years. Like that's almost like the water, like in hiring at this point. It's like, of course you have to do that. That's like a no-brainer. I mean, it's pretty sweet to feel like you guys kind of made that happen at Greenhouse.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. Definitely not my insight. And even the founders, I think they like went and discovered, what the best practices were and devised a way to make it happen inside of in the product. But I do think that there's like an interesting insight maybe that's transferable to other people as well. Where if there's already a bunch of research in your discipline, what were the best ideas that people believe in that have not yet been implemented in the software everyone uses? That might be like a good way of discovering something that sort of like pre-built to resonate and has pre-built evidence to support the approach.
Yeah. It also really just drives home how like SaaS and the tools drive culture and best practices. And it's kind of this like virtuous circle where, you're not just shipping like a technology that makes you more efficient. It's also like encoding workflows that produce better results. And that's a lot of what people are buying as well, not just a tool to help them get something done. Like they actually don't know like what is the best practice in order to achieve the best results here. And, a business with the focus on recruiting, your job is to help people also discover like what is the right way to do this.
Yeah, totally. And so one of the interesting insights actually with the current business that I'm working on, Otti, was that like, you go through the recruiting process, there's clear stuff you're looking for as part of the job. Then you get hired and it all disappears. Like it's almost never that you're then having clear conversations about, what those expectations were, how things are going, how they relate to the work that you're doing once you actually enter the company. And so, how do we help solve for making sure that people do actually understand like what it looks like to succeed in their job and that managers are playing an active role in helping them succeed in their job. So I think that same insight, interestingly, could still be pulled forward because while it is the water now in recruiting, it's not yet the water actually in management, even though it's sort of obviously a better way.
That's super cool. I'm really curious about, throughout these scaling periods, like it must have been really key, your relationships with like the other key stakeholders and functions between like sales and marketing and like your CEO. Were there any things that like you did to make sure that you guys were super well aligned? And like, what did that back and forth look like as like, as a CTO, you're balancing all sorts of things like, well, we can't ship X feature because we have to like, migrate the database because, it's falling over because of, we added 10x the scale in the last 6 months. We need some slack time to take care of this stuff. And then we can do this thing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think cross-functional work was probably my greatest learning curve actually at Greenhouse, just like figuring out how do I work with people in different functions and, both from a relationship and priority perspective. So the first thing that I did, and this is more about like my own imposter syndrome, as a CTO, was like, I want to understand what everyone else's job is. Cause like, I don't know what a marketer does. I don't know what a salesperson does day to day, I don't know how finance thinks about things. So I did have like a little trick that I still recommend to people. It's kind of time consuming, but most definitely worth it of like, read a couple of books that are like the famous books that everyone's read on all of those other functions, like every other function in the business. So, if you want to learn about sales, read like the Challenger sale, spin selling, stuff like that. If you, I wound up doing an online certificate in financial management so I could talk to the finance people and the board better. I wound up reading a bunch of marketing books. I read books on customer support, on customer success, on, product management, on design, and I think that gave me not only like some common language, but like a bit of an understanding of what mental framework they had for how they thought about the world. It didn't make me an expert, but it allowed me to sort of like speak enough that we could hold a conversation on the topic and I could understand more of what they were talking about. It's like if you go to a foreign country, I don't know if you speak any other languages, but if you like speak like this much, they immediately like, if they know English, they're going to like switch to English and like, you're not actually going to get to practice. If you speak like this much, then they'll probably like talk to you for a little bit, even if they are better at English, because like there's a sort of window of tolerance and your effort has been like demonstrated. And so they want to like engage with that. And I think that's true with cross-functional collaboration as well. The other thing I learned that I think is hard for CTOs is like the way of thinking and collaborating with others or taking feedback can be really different in other teams. Engineers, I think, are taught to think, how do I get to the best solution no matter what. And we beat up each other's ideas and we examine approaches as if they're not personal, because they're not. And like you kind of get that real feeling of like, whether we choose to go down path A or path B in terms of architectural decision making, it's not because like I am good or bad. We should get to like whatever the best algorithm is, and we can almost like we could mathematically prove this was the best choice. And so like, let's not debate it on subjective merits. Let's debate it on its like, objective merits. That's definitely not true with how work feels in most other functions of the business. That for most people, they are investing a lot of energy personally in whatever it is that they're building, and they're not practiced in the same way. And I'm not saying that from a sort of superiority complex sense of like engineers know how to do this better. It's just a different culture. That like they're not practiced in thinking about their ideas as being totally separate from themselves. And so exploring like, well, what about all of these other things could feel antagonizing or like condescending of like, have you not thought through this thing thoroughly? Because, we're professionals at thinking through things. Maybe you need an engineer to help you in sales or something. So I think that was like a little bit of a thing that I had to learn some communication style tweaks to demonstrate clearly that like, yes, I do understand that you're as smart as me. Yes, I understand that you actually know way more about your discipline than I do. And like, how do I have like good exploratory conversations so that we can like collaborate together on getting to whatever the best outcome is? And so that's kind of nuanced. I definitely don't have like an automatic tip or trick, but like literally just being aware of the fact that people are going to process, feedback or, even analysis of their work in a really different way outside of engineering than inside of engineering. I can feel it now, by the way. Like now I'm sort of doing like the early founder-led sales stuff. And like my mood is dictated in some ways by like, oh, that was a great meeting. I'm feeling awesome. Like everything is great. And then the opposite thing happens. And like I had a bad meeting, like, and you kind of like get your emotions entangled with your work. I didn't feel that way as an engineer. And I definitely felt that way more doing sort of sales type work. And so building empathy for like the different experiences people are having when they're doing their job and modulating communication a bit.
That reminds me about how kind of at early Nihilus, we had an office that was just like one big room. And, we had engineering on one side, we had sales and marketing on the other side. And sales wanted to play music all the time in the office because they're like, we got to get hyped for our calls. And the engineers were like, we need to concentrate, we want quiet, like no, like low key vibes. And I don't think we ever figured out a solution for that. I just came away with it of like, different people have different needs. And like, the way sales needs to show up at work is very different from the way the engineering needs to show up at work.
Yeah, totally. And so I think Greenhouse eventually wound up with just like different floors.
Yeah. Just got to give people their own space.
Yeah. But actually, I had a little thing that I did almost just purely out of excitement that I think did a huge amount to build empathy functionally. I wound up doing this thing with the very first days at Greenhouse and kept doing it all the way through when I left, called Coffee is for Closers. And so anybody who hit their quota, I would buy a coffee every single month, and I would make sure they all knew, like, I want to run up this bill as high as possible. And I would pay for it out of my own personal bank account too. It was like not like a company expense. It was like, I'm happy to buy $80 worth of coffees. That just meant like 20 AEs like hit their quota or whatever it is. And so when I bought them coffee, it wasn't just about like giving them a thing. It was spending time with them. And then I got to understand, like, from the there's some SMB AE who started 6 months ago. Like, what's been easy? What's been hard? What are you running into? What are the biggest like issues that are happening day to day? Like, what's painful about onboarding? Then I wound up building these really close relationships where individual contributors and other departments wound up trusting me as, part of their world. And they saw that I took an interest in it. So I think taking an interest in like not just the other execs, especially if you're in an exec role, but like getting to know the people who are actually doing the work across the company isn't just like instructive. It's like, it actually, like, I think shapes that empathy and understanding for what's happening. Like SDR, it's like, yeah, it's a hard job. It's hard to do that all day, every day. Like, we should like respect the difficulty of it.
Mhm. That's a really cool way of just kind of breaking down the silos that happen between different functions. Was there like a key moment or like a friction point or story around like what caused you to decide I need to understand better like what it's like to be in sales or what it's like to be in marketing?
I think it was the off by one on being a founder thing, actually, was probably it. So it was like, yeah, both of the founders of Greenhouse, and, they were about 10 years older than me. They'd already been successful in their careers, and I was sort of younger at the time when I first started, and I was there to learn. And so, as the company progressed, I could see that, okay, I'm like leading engineering and that part's going well. But I really kind of wanted to make sure that I could be part of any conversation. And I did know that they understood how the whole business worked together. That, and they're smart, good mechanical thinkers. And so they understood how, the funnel went from people getting awareness, that the brand exists, and social validation from others. And, then they see a white paper and they continue moving down the funnel all the way to becoming a sale. And once they're, a sale, then they get onboarded. If you do fail to onboard them successfully, then there's a failure point there. If you onboard them successfully, then they stick around. Now, how do you prove value as they, stay with you? How do you figure out how to expand the account? How do you figure out to sell them, how to sell them more products? And how do you balance all those things with the finances and, people problems that are happening around? So there was this like complex understanding of like the physics of a company that they had. And I could see that I understood bits and pieces of it. And when I didn't understand one of the pieces, it was almost like now I can't speak the same language anymore. Like, you just switched into a language I don't understand. And I had a personal feeling of frustration, not at the other person, but like with myself, anytime I, hadn't learned the vocabulary to be able to participate in the conversation. And I realized the more I understood, not just like the vocabulary and the ideas that they, had going through their head about how to run a business, the better I actually could leverage my own intuitions in making decisions within engineering. So I'll give you an example of one of the moments. So ThoughtWorks, I think, had a Beijing office, and ThoughtWorks has been a Greenhouse customer for a really long time, still a Greenhouse customer, and a great partner over the years. So lots of respect. They had a Beijing office. And so all of a sudden they were like, we're having all these like great firewall issues. This is like 2016. Things are getting blocked, connections are getting dropped, like assets aren't loading. And so as an engineer, I'm kind of like, well, we have to fix that problem for them. Like, we can't just like let them have a bad experience in China. Like, this is one of our big customers. Like, we have to make sure it works. And so I had added to my roadmap for like engineering projects for the quarter, like fix the great firewall problems, and started spending time talking to a bunch of people about like different things that you could do for that. And I remember, there was actually a workaround. Like, you could get people to get on a VPN. And when they were on the VPN, it might be a little bit slower, but it did work. Now, what I didn't understand was like, they were kind of like the only company having that problem, and there was a workaround. The business decision I was about to make was to spend, let's say, hundreds of thousands of dollars plus some opportunity cost on solving this problem for this one customer. And it was not actually like the right value judgment for that moment. We actually wound up maybe 2 years later investing a bunch in fixing more of those things so that it would work, for people who are in a similar situation. And it did make sense at the time to do it. We had a broader customer base. There wasn't a workaround for all of those issues. And so understanding like how to make good, reasoned business decisions, not just based on whatever it seems like the biggest fire this second, requires a little bit of like, sophistication, understanding what the trade-offs are, and why A is more important than B. I'm sure you've run into similar classes of issues, but that was one with China that I remember.
I have a question. I love asking this to people because they're always fun stories, and usually it's far enough in the past that you can laugh at it. But like, you've been in all parts of these businesses that have had these massive, scaling issues that you've run into and that you've managed to overcome all that. I'm curious, do you have any fun stories of like big mistakes you made, either on the engineering side, the personnel side, any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So you remember the trace commas scene from Silicon Valley?
Yeah. From like the wine he had, right?
He had like made his billionaire tequila, and then someone had left the tequila bottle like on the keyboard, and that wound up causing the site to go down like over and over again. 1 week later, it's Friday night. Everyone's hanging out in the office after a good long work week. I have a whiskey in hand. It's like maybe 8 p.m. And there's probably still like a couple dozen people there or something like that. And then all of a sudden, one of the engineers comes up and like very calmly was just like, "Site's down." I'm like, shit. It's like, relatively early, happens sometimes. So, but you got to go deal with it right that second. And so I go over to my keyboard and I open up a terminal and start trying to figure out what's going on. And, I'm like, found the logs of what's happening. We're getting like absolutely slammed. So I'm like, oh my God, it's like there's like a denial of service attack happening right now. And then I start, looking and figuring out where the IP address is. And I'm like, it's coming from inside the office. Like, oh my God, we're being like attacked. Someone's like, everybody check the closets, like see who's like hiding in our office, like doing an in-office, like, denial of service attack. And someone goes, maybe it's like that Silicon Valley seed. And I'm like, shit. And so one of the product managers, this guy, Murph, I was like, can you just like go run around and see? Like on the off chance that is true, that might be happening. Turned out our head of customer success, which is perfect because she was the one who had to deal with the problem later, had put her headphones down on the space key while inside of a back-end search bar that had no rate limiting.
Oh my God.
So it was like only in a system that we would use anyway, but we hadn't rate limited it. And so she was like DOSing our website by like having millions of requests go through on like turbo mode from her keyboard on this unrate limited search box. So that actually happened in real life at Greenhouse, and we took down the site for like 10 minutes or something with headphones on a keyboard.
Those search queries are always like the most intense on the database as well, of course.
Yeah, well, actually, it was like an open search query too. So it was like select star from the table, and there's like where it was like an empty value, like on an unindexed
like a like query.
Yeah.
Oh God.
On that front, I don't think I've ever had a moment where I'm like, oh, I want to hold this key down on the keyboard and have it fire over and over again. I don't know who asked for that feature.
Yeah. I remember turbo mode used to be a thing back in like the late 80s, early 90s, and it was for gaming. It was so I could just hold down spacebar and continue shooting monsters in Doom.
Gotcha.
So that's at 43, I know the origin story.
That's awesome.
So we're getting to be almost out of time here, but before we wrap, you in the last couple of years left Greenhouse and are working on a new thing. What's it like to start fresh again? And you're the CEO now. You're the boss.
I am. Well, I'm now the boss of like 9 people, whereas I have 100 at Greenhouse. So
is it an upgrade or a downgrade?
well, totally different in every way. I mean, it's been like exactly what I expected in some ways. So, upsides are I'm in the game that I want to play, right? Like I chose like what to go do, and I get to realize a lot of the vision in my head of like how things should be, and get to sort of like quantum leap style, like right the wrongs of the past, like what can I do differently this time, from the mistakes I made my previous go around. And at the same time, like any person who's ever actually gone through the founding journey, like it's hard. The first couple of years are hard. They were hard at Greenhouse when I wasn't a founder and I was the founding engineer. And there's just a million puzzles to solve. I think that's like the best way to describe it. It's like you start with literally nothing. You don't have a name, you don't have a logo, you don't know what you're going after, you don't have a validated idea about how to solve a problem, you have no product, you have no customers, you have nothing, right? And so starting from nothing is intimidating, but there's like an infinitely open world. And then you have to start making a bunch of decisions, and each of those decisions both make the thing more real and constrain other options. Like now that you're doing this, you can't do that. So like now that we're making, software and management, we're definitely not going to make like a video game, that's like a Pokemon spinoff or whatever, right? Like you're not going to do certain things once you've made decisions. And it's kind of like it's Markov chain, just to be like a total nerd. It's like, and so I think that's all been super interesting. And I think we've mostly made good decisions, but then you also make lots and lots of bad decisions along the way. And you're like, how do I remedy those, or which ones do I accept as I go? So I think it's been exactly as I would have expected. High amplitude feelings of, oh my God, we got it. And, the inevitable lows where you're like, there's 85 more puzzles that I have to solve in the next year, right? And if I don't solve, 82 of them, like, then, there's that feeling of like the company will fail or something. I just came back from a founder retreat. I'd mentioned I, went to Tahoe, and that was like a founder retreat with 50 other founders of a bunch of different companies doing all manner of things. They all kind of have the same feeling, which is like, the success of the company is really closely linked to how you feel about yourself in a way that like, isn't necessarily like, the most healthy, but it is a pervasive experience. That when you get to be the CEO and founder, you get to build your own vision. It does feel very personal, and so I think that's maybe a struggle, but I think one that is, I think 100% of people end up feeling. As the person who's on stage talking about this mentioned, unless you're a sociopath.
Yeah. I think, there's kind of like twin devils here that map to the roller coaster. There's, the feeling of agency. You could change anything. You can make anything the rules. You can do whatever you want because, you're the one who's driving this new thing. And at the same time, like, if it doesn't work out and if it fails, like, you have nobody else to blame but yourself.
That's right.
And there's times when you feel like you're on top of the world, and then there's times when you feel like you're depressed and it's never going to work. And I think one of the keys is to like be able to separate out like what are things that are fixable and like what is kind of just your own psyche, like stuck in a pattern of like go to bed and think about this tomorrow because there's a path through this. You're just not seeing it now.
Yeah, totally. And managing yourself is as much work as like figuring out the company through the process. So it's intense growth, and only people who like want an intense life and choose to become founders in the first place. So I definitely wanted that and chose it, as I'm sure you did.
Yeah, and then you get addicted and you just get bored if you're not in that space.
Totally. It's like, why am I not under constant pressure anymore?
It's a pathology.
Totally. All right.
Cool. Well, this has been a fascinating and insightful conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us here today, Mike. It's been super fun.
Yeah, totally. Really great hanging with you both, and it seems like we have lots of shared experiences through the whole thing.
Yeah, I love getting the chance to connect.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, send us a DM on LinkedIn. This show is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com.